There is a moment early in life when you learn the most dangerous lesson a human being can learn, that love, attention, and respect can be earned through effort. You watch a parent withhold approval until you perform well enough, and something inside you concludes that withdrawal is a puzzle to be solved rather than a message to be heeded. This lesson follows you into adulthood disguised as devotion. You call it loyalty. You call it patience. You call it belief in another person's potential. In truth, it is a psychological trap, one of the oldest in human history, and it has ruined kings, generals, lovers, and ordinary people who simply could not accept that someone had already given them their answer. Consider the nature of attention itself. Attention is the most valuable currency in human affairs, more valuable than money, because money can be printed and attention cannot. Every human being, consciously or not, understands this. Those who possess a surplus of attention from others learn quickly what it costs them to give it away carelessly, and so they begin to ration it, testing who will chase and who will not. This is not cruelty, it is instinct. The same instinct that governs every social species on Earth. When you chase someone who has stopped giving you attention, you are not pursuing a person. You are pursuing a resource they have already decided not to spend on you. And no one in the history of the species has ever won back a resource by demonstrating how badly they wanted it. Study the courts of old Europe, and you will find this law written into every intrigue. The courtier who groveled before the king, who sent letter after letter begging for an audience, was the courtier who was quietly moved further from the throne. The one who mastered himself, who appeared occupied with his own affairs, who seemed almost indifferent to royal favor, was the one who was summoned. Kings, like all people who hold power, are drawn to those who do not need them. Neediness broadcasts itself instantly. It has an odor that cannot be masked by fine words or grand gestures. The moment you chase, you announce to the other person that you have already lost, that your sense of worth has become dependent on their response. And human beings, almost universally, retreat from those who make themselves so transparently dependent. This is the deeper truth you must absorb. When someone ignores you, they have already communicated everything you need to know. Silence is not an absence of information, it is information. The person who does not respond, who lets your messages sit unanswered, who offers only cold or intermittent acknowledgement, is teaching you something about their priorities, and your task is not to argue with the lesson, but to learn from it. Yet the wounded ego cannot accept this. The wounded ego insists that if it simply tries harder, explains itself more clearly, offers more of itself, the silence will break. This is the same delusion that has driven gamblers to ruin at the tables. The belief that persistence alone can bend outcomes that are, in fact, governed by entirely different forces than your effort. Look at history's great seducers, the ones who left a trail of admirers rather than a trail of rejections. They shared one trait above all others: they never chased for long. The moment they sensed disinterest, they withdrew, not sulking, not dramatically, but with a quiet and total redirection of their energy elsewhere. This withdrawal was not a trick, though it often produced the effect of drawing the other person back in. It was, more fundamentally, a form of self-respect so deeply ingrained that it had become instinctive. They understood a law that most people spend their whole lives refusing to learn: desire is inflamed by scarcity and killed by abundance. The moment you make yourself abundantly available, endlessly patient, infinitely forgiving of neglect, you extinguish whatever ember of interest might have existed. You do this to yourself. No enemy is required. There is also a matter of self-knowledge that chasing conveniently allows you to avoid. It is far easier to fixate on someone who ignores you than to sit alone with the question of why you need their validation so badly in the first place. The chase becomes a form of anesthesia. As long as you are composing the next message, rehearsing the next explanation, imagining the future reconciliation, you do not have to confront the emptier and more uncomfortable questions. What am I actually building in my own life? What have I neglected in myself while I poured my attention into a person who has made their disinterest plain? The chase is, in this sense, a hiding place. It feels like passion, but it is often avoidance wearing passion's clothing. Human beings are exquisitely sensitive to power dynamics, even when they claim not to be, even when they pride themselves on being unmoved by such considerations. Every interaction carries an invisible current beneath it. Who wants more? Who needs more? Who would be more devastated by the ending of the connection? The person who chases has, often without realizing it, handed over the entirety of this current to the other party. And once someone senses they hold this power completely, unconditionally, without having done anything to earn or maintain it, they will use it, sometimes cruelly, sometimes carelessly, but almost always to their own advantage. This is not because people are monstrous. It is because unchecked power over another person's emotions is one of the most intoxicating substances known to the human mind, and very few can resist tasting it once they know it is theirs for free. You must understand, too, that ignoring is often itself a form of control, whether the other person admits this to themselves or not. Some people have learned through years of relationships and social experimentation that a well-timed silence produces more devotion than any kind word ever could. They do not need to be villains to exploit this. They need only have discovered at some point in their lives that withdrawal works. If you chase such a person, you are not pursuing connection. You are reinforcing a strategy that will be used against you again and again, in this relationship and in every one after it, because you will have taught them, through your own behavior, that this is how to manage you. The antidote to all of this is not bitterness. Bitterness is simply chasing turned inside out. It keeps the other person at the center of your emotional life just as surely as pursuit did. The antidote is redirection, a complete and disciplined turning of your attention back toward your own ambitions, your own craft, your own development as a person of substance. This is not a strategy to win the other person back, though it often has that effect as a side benefit. It is a recognition that your time and your emotional energy are the only truly finite resources you possess, and every hour spent decoding someone else's silence is an hour stolen from the construction of your own life. Consider the discipline required of anyone who has ever mastered a craft, a swordsman, a strategist, an artist of any kind. Such people learn early that obsession with an opponent's next move or an audience's approval produces only anxiety and weakness. Mastery requires that you turn inward, that you become so absorbed in your own development that external validation becomes almost irrelevant to your sense of purpose. This same discipline must be applied to matters of the heart and of friendship. The person who does not chase, who is deeply engaged in building something of their own, radiates a kind of magnetism that no amount of desperate pursuit could ever manufacture. This is not a paradox to be gamed. It is simply what happens when a human being stops leaking energy toward those who will not reciprocate it and starts investing that same energy into their own becoming. There is an old and uncomfortable truth in all of this. Those who ignore you are, in a strange way, doing you a favor, though it rarely feels like one at the time. They are showing you plainly and without ambiguity where you stand, sparing you the much longer and more painful process of discovering this after years of investment. The wise among us learn to read this signal quickly and act on it decisively, while the unwise spend months or years trying to argue with a truth that was delivered to them free of charge in a single unanswered message. Do not despise the silence study. It is teaching you with brutal efficiency exactly what you need to know. You must also reckon honestly with what chasing does to your own character over time. Each act of pursuit, each unanswered message sent anyway, each excuse manufactured for another person's coldness chips away at your own sense of dignity. This erosion is slow and largely invisible while it is happening, which is precisely what makes it so dangerous. You do not wake up one day and decide to become someone who begs for scraps of attention. You arrive there through 1,000 small concessions, each one seeming reasonable in isolation. The remedy is to notice the pattern before it calcifies into identity, to catch yourself at the third unanswered message, not the 30th, and ask what kind of person you are becoming in the act of sending it. The great figures of history and of the courts, the generals, the strategists, the master seducers of old, all shared an underlying philosophy that can be reduced to a single principle: never reveal the full weight of your desire to someone who has not earned the right to know it. This is not dishonesty, it is self-preservation. The moment your desire becomes fully visible, it becomes a tool that others can use to manipulate you, whether they intend cruelty or not. Reserve in this sense is not coldness. It is the armor that allows genuine warmth to be offered safely to those who have demonstrated they will not exploit it. Reflect, too, on the biological roots of this entire drama. Long before language, before courts, before letters and unanswered messages, animals of every social species practiced a version of this exact calculation. The one who pursued too eagerly, who abandoned all restraint in the presence of a potential mate or ally, was marked as low status, easily controlled, unworthy of continued investment. The one who maintained composure, who did not fling themselves forward at every signal of possible interest, was read as strong, self-sufficient, valuable. This calculus runs so deep in us that no amount of modern sophistication has erased it. When you chase, some ancient part of the other person's mind registers weakness, regardless of what their conscious mind might say about kindness or fairness. None of this means you must become cold or manipulative yourself. It means you must recognize the game that is already being played, whether you consented to play it or not, and refuse to be the only participant handing over your position for free. Dignity is not withheld love. It is love offered from a place of wholeness rather than desperation. The two are almost impossible to distinguish from the outside in the early moments of any exchange, but their long-term effects on how you are treated could not be more different. There will be a temptation in the aftermath of choosing to stop chasing to interpret this restraint as a strategy aimed entirely at winning the other person back. Resist this interpretation. If your withdrawal is merely a more sophisticated form of pursuit, dressed up as detachment, the other person will sense it immediately because human beings are remarkably skilled at detecting performance, even skilled performance. True withdrawal must be sincere. It must be rooted in an actual redirection of your attention and hope toward your own life, your own goals, your own healing. Anything less is simply chasing wearing a disguise, and disguises of this kind rarely survive contact with a perceptive audience. What you will find if you commit fully to this redirection is that your capacity for genuine connection actually deepens rather than withers. Freed from the constant low hum of anxiety that chasing produces, the checking, the waiting, the interpreting of silences, your mind becomes available again for the people and pursuits that are actually reciprocating your investment. This is the great and often overlooked reward of walking away from those who ignore you. Not merely the avoidance of humiliation, but the recovery of an enormous quantity of psychological energy that can now be spent on people and projects that are actually alive to your presence. Understand finally that every person who has ever ignored you was, in that act, revealing something about their own capacity and priorities at that moment in their life, not delivering a verdict on your worth as a human being. The two are entirely separate matters, though the wounded mind conflates them instantly. Someone's silence may reflect their fear, their distraction, their own unresolved history, their incapacity for depth, or simply their honest lack of interest. But it does not reflect an objective measurement of your value, because no such measurement exists, and no single person, however important they seem to you in this moment, holds the authority to issue it. The sooner you separate another person's behavior from your own sense of worth, the sooner you free yourself to walk toward people and pursuits that will actually meet you where you stand, rather than leaving you forever reaching toward a door that has already been quietly closed. Every act of pursuit carries within it a confession. You may believe you are simply expressing devotion, demonstrating patience, or proving your seriousness, but to the person receiving your pursuit, none of this registers as strength. It registers as disclosure. You have told them, without meaning to, exactly how much power they hold over your emotional state, and once this information has been transmitted, it cannot be recalled. This is the first and most important thing to understand about chasing. It is never received as the gesture you intend it to be. You intend devotion, they perceive dependency. You intend loyalty, they perceive desperation. The gap between your intention and their perception is not a misunderstanding to be corrected with better words. It is a fixed law of human psychology, as reliable as gravity, and no amount of eloquence will suspend it. Think of desire as a kind of pressure system. When something is scarce, when its availability is uncertain, the mind assigns it value automatically, without conscious deliberation. This is why a person who is difficult to reach, who has a life full of their own pursuits, who does not respond within seconds provokes more fascination than one who answers instantly and stays available at all hours. This is not a cynical manipulation invented by the calculating. It is simply how the human mind is built to evaluate importance. Scarcity signals value. Abundance signals the opposite. The moment you make yourself infinitely available to someone who has already begun to withdraw, you personally destroy the pressure system that might have drawn them back. You do their work for them. You remove the very scarcity that could have reignited their interest, and you do it with your own hands, believing all the while that you are helping your cause. Watch what happens physiologically in a person who senses they are being chased without limit. There is, at first, perhaps a flicker of flattery, but flattery fades quickly into something closer to fatigue, and fatigue soon curdles into a mild contempt, not necessarily conscious, not necessarily cruel, but real nonetheless. Contempt arises because a person who no longer has to work for something ceases to value it, and worse, begins to see the constant availability of the other person as evidence of a character flaw. They start to wonder, half-consciously, why you have so much free time, so much energy, so much attention to spend on someone who has shown you so little. They begin to suspect, often correctly, that your own life must be thin in other places for this pursuit to occupy so much space in it. This suspicion, once seated, is almost impossible to remove through further pursuit. Every additional message, every further gesture of persistence only confirms the diagnosis. There is also a question of what chasing communicates about your own self-assessment. When you pursue someone relentlessly after they have made their disinterest clear, you are implicitly declaring that your own value depends entirely on their reciprocation, that without their attention you have decided you are worth less. People are remarkably attuned to this kind of self-assessment in others, even when it goes unspoken. We take our cues about how to treat someone from how that person appears to regard themselves. A person who telegraphs, through relentless pursuit, that they have already discounted their own worth, will find that others discount it too. This is not fairness. It is simply the mechanism by which social value gets assigned in practice. Others largely adopt the valuation you present to them. Consider also the matter of timing, which chasing almost always violates. There is a natural rhythm to any healthy connection, a rhythm of advance and retreat, of engagement and space that mirrors breathing itself. Chasing collapses this rhythm into a single unbroken exhale, an endless output with no corresponding intake. It is exhausting to witness, let alone to be the object of. People instinctively pull back from anything that breathes only outward, sensing correctly that such a rhythm is unsustainable and, more importantly, unequal. A relationship, romantic, professional, or otherwise, requires two parties contributing something scarce to each other. When one party abandons all restraint, the exchange stops being a relationship and becomes a form of extraction, and the person being pursued senses this shift even if they cannot articulate it precisely. The great error of the chaser is believing that intensity of effort can substitute for the actual conditions that produce desire. But desire is not manufactured through volume. It is manufactured through mystery, through autonomy, through the sense that the other person's attention is one option among many rather than a certainty on offer at all hours. Every additional act of pursuit, however well-intentioned, destroys a further fragment of this mystery. You cannot explain your way into being desired. You cannot apologize your way into being desired. You cannot, through sheer accumulated effort, override a psychological mechanism that has operated in the human animal since long before either of you existed. The harder you push against this law, the more thoroughly you confirm in the other person's mind that you do not understand it, and a person who does not understand this law is, by that very fact, less compelling than one who does. What you are left with, then, is a choice between two paths that only appear similar on the surface. One path is to keep transmitting your desire outward, hoping that enough repetition will eventually produce a different outcome. The other is to recognize that the transmission itself is the problem, that every signal of pursuit sent after disinterest has been shown only deepens the very dynamic you are trying to escape. The pressure system that creates real desire cannot be forced into existence through effort. It can only be allowed to exist by your own restraint, and restraint, however difficult it feels in the moment, is the only signal that has ever reliably reversed the direction of another person's attention. Silence is the most misunderstood language in human affairs. Most people treat it as an absence, a gap waiting to be filled with explanation, effort, or further words. But silence is never truly empty. It is dense with meaning, more honest in many cases than speech itself, because speech can be performed, softened, calculated for effect, while silence, particularly sustained silence, is far harder to fake. When a person stops responding to you, stops initiating contact, stops offering the small signals of warmth they once gave freely, they have delivered a message with a clarity that words could rarely match. The mistake is not in receiving this message. The mistake is in refusing to believe that a message has been sent at all. Consider how differently we would behave if we treated silence with the same seriousness we treat explicit statements. If someone told you plainly, in words, that they no longer wish to engage with you as they once did, you would feel foolish continuing to pursue them, as though nothing had changed. Yet when the same information arrives wrapped in silence rather than sentences, something in the human mind refuses to accept it at face value. We tell ourselves stories to soften the blow. They are busy, they are going through something difficult, they will surely return to form once circumstances change. Sometimes these stories are true, but far more often they are constructed precisely because the truth is unbearable, and a comforting narrative is easier to live inside than an honest reckoning with rejection. This refusal to read silence accurately is not a small error. It compounds over time because every day spent interpreting silence charitably is a day spent avoiding the actual work of adjustment, the recalibration of expectations, the redirection of hope, the quiet mourning that must happen before a person can move forward. Delaying this reckoning does not make it smaller when it finally arrives. It only makes it larger because you have spent the intervening weeks or months investing further hope into a situation the other person had already resolved in their own mind long before you caught up to it. They are, in effect, ahead of you in a process you have not yet allowed yourself to begin. There is also a peculiar cruelty in how differently silence is deployed, depending on who wields it. Some people withdraw honestly simply because their feelings have genuinely changed, and their silence is a natural, unstrategic consequence of diminished interest. Others, however, have learned, whether through natural instinct or through years of observing how people respond, that silence is an instrument, a lever that can be pulled to produce exactly the reaction you are having right now. Increased effort, increased attention, increased displays of devotion from the other party. For this second category of person, your response to their silence is not incidental, it is the entire point. Every time you chase after a period of silence and are rewarded, even slightly, with a small crumb of attention, you confirm to them that withdrawal is an effective tool for managing you. You are, quite literally, training them to continue using it. The same way any behavior reinforced with intermittent reward becomes more entrenched rather than less. This is among the oldest and most reliable mechanisms in behavioral psychology, Rewards that arrive unpredictably after periods of absence produce far more persistent and compulsive pursuit than rewards that arrive consistently. A person who understands this, even unconsciously, has little incentive to change a strategy that is working exactly as intended. To break this cycle requires a shift in how you relate to the information silence provides. Rather than treating it as an obstacle to be overcome through your own persistence, you must begin treating it as data to be studied dispassionately, the way a strategist studies the movements of an opponent, rather than pleading with them to move differently. What does the pattern of this silence actually tell you? Is it total, or does it lift occasionally? And if so, under what conditions does it lift? Does it correlate with your own displays of effort, growing longer precisely when you have shown more devotion, or does it seem indifferent to anything you do? These are not romantic questions, and they may feel almost clinical to ask, but clinical distance is precisely what allows you to see the situation as it actually is, rather than as your hopes would prefer it to be. Reading silence accurately also requires you to separate the message from your feelings about the message. It is entirely possible to receive a piece of information you find painful and still process it clearly without distorting its meaning to make it more bearable. A skilled negotiator does not pretend an opponent's refusal means something other than refusal simply because the refusal is inconvenient. They adjust their strategy accordingly. You must apply the same discipline here. The silence is not cruel or kind in itself, it simply is. Your task is not to argue with it, negotiate with it, or wear it down through repetition, but to accept what it tells you and act on that information as decisively as you would act on any other piece of clear intelligence about your circumstances. There is finally a kind of dignity available only to those willing to read silence honestly and immediately, rather than after months of wishful reinterpretation. This dignity does not come from pretending the silence does not hurt. It often does considerably. It comes from refusing to let that hurt distort your perception of what has actually occurred. The people who recover most quickly from being ignored are rarely those who felt the rejection least. They are those who accepted the message being sent to them the first time it arrived, rather than waiting for it to be repeated in increasingly unmistakable terms until denial became impossible. Every additional cycle of hope and disappointment you allow yourself by refusing to trust the silence costs you something that cannot be recovered: time, energy, and the growing conviction that your own perception cannot be trusted, when in fact your perception was accurate from the very first unanswered message.